You heard it, recording in progress.
And
Welcome
now we're pleased to bring you our feature presentation.
in a world, where we actually might someday meet each other. Trailers, movie history today. What we do, let's do the happy screen share. Oh, and we have a visitor. I haven't brought him into the house. I hear turkey poop is kind of messy, but this is Big Red, my gay turkey. He's a red bourbon turkey, and he pays unwarranted attention to the roosters. He's out in the yard. I may bring him in next time. Anyway, he does exist. Getting ready for the holidays, Big Red will survive. Anyway, what we do up and coming is that we have one of my little extra credit quizzes be posted after class. A little behind on the grading because I've been under the weather. It's just a cold, have been tested. It's all fine. But a little slow. We'll get it. Final exam Wednesday, December 1st. Goes online 8 a.m. Friday, December 3rd. Got the usual 2 days. I will take most of the questions from the review session and these class notes that I've been starting to use. We'll have the review session Tuesday. I know many of you will be on the road. Do not expect a big attendance day, but it'll be recorded, and I hope I get a couple of you to keep me company. Anyway, so that's up and coming in a world, as they say in the movie trailer history. We are looking at movies today. The big thing with movies is not just visual, but they give us visual storytelling. Right from the beginning of class, we talked about how you create a narrative naturally. You get a set of facts and you make a story of it, whether you want to or not. Movies do that on purpose. TV, you see it, you make your own story, and it's a fire, it's a murder, it's whatever, but you make your own story. Movies give you visual storytelling. Movies are communal, they are shared. You go out and see a movie with somebody. You go to the theater, it takes some effort. You have to go out. That makes it a bigger deal and has a lot more cultural impact. Movies gave us so many of our stereotypes: cowboys, strong women, fast talking comics, all of that. It also, since they came from Hollywood, other countries, that's how other countries get to know us. The downside is we call that cultural imperialism. American movies show perhaps violence. They show more skin than you would in a Muslim country. They might not like that. So, it does there's America to the world, and not everybody appreciates it. And of course, movies change over time. Also, it's our third major mass medium. From the beginning of civilization, you have print. And then all of a sudden, that's all you have is reading. And all of a sudden, in the early 1900s, boom, you have radio, you have sound. Then you have movies, and you got vision. All of a sudden, all your senses are engaged. So it's big changes. You know, that really people born from the 1890s who lived into the 70s and 80s probably saw more changes in the universe than even our generation today. Anyway, a little bit of history. History goes back, you know, beyond, there's ideas in the 1800s and projectors, but our old friend Tom Edison put the package together.
In this episode, we will discuss the first 20 years of cinema, from its birth to the rise of the feature film. We call this period pre-classical because the films that belong to it don't follow the classical narrative conventions that come with the rise of the feature film. In order to understand this time period, we really must begin with the invention of the motion picture camera. Many credit the Americans with the invention of the motion picture camera, particularly one American, Thomas Edison. Not only did Thomas Edison not invent the motion picture camera, it was actually made by a team of engineers under Thomas Edison. It wasn't even the Americans who first came up with the motion picture camera. In fact,
a lot of people, just like television, a lot of people working on the same ideas at the same time. But it became dominant in this country, and we'll go into why.
Several entrepreneurs from all over the world have claims to what is the first motion picture camera. As with many other examples in American cinema, Edison's reputation relies more on his marketing skills than it does the...
Just like David Sarnoff. Yeah, Edison was a good inventor. He gets his packet, puts the package together, not really unlike Alexander Graham Bell, but he was a great promoter.
The actual facts. And if credit's going to go to Edison and the Americans, it must also be shared with the French, particularly one team, the Lumiere brothers.
Perhaps the most influential filmmakers of early cinema, the French Lumiere brothers made world history when they invented the cinematograph, the world leader in motion picture technology. At the end of 1895, in what might be the most famous night of cinema, the Lumiere brothers premiered 10 short films in Paris. These films were under 50 seconds long and were varied, from a comedy to a simple shot of people leaving a factory. The night was a success and abuzz with demand. The Lumiere brothers began...
Not unlike photography, and Daguerre, also in Paris 60 years earlier.
Making film after film, with a focus on documentaries. The success of their documentary films, coupled with the fictional pictures of their contemporary Georges Méliès, gave the French an edge against their American competition at the turn of the century.
Early Méliès.
However, the Lumiere success was short-lived, and unable to see the narrative potential of cinema. The brothers stated that the cinema...
There you go. We saw that in photography. Who wants to see a picture on television? The Kodak didn't want digital photography. These guys said, okay, we play a few tricks. They kind of missed something.
Is an invention without any future.
Whoops.
Because of this, their fame was eclipsed by the narrative films that soon followed.
Now, before we get too ahead of ourselves, it's important to kind of define what cinema was like in this period. Cinema attendants and audience members didn't go to the cinema for narratives or great stories. In fact, they went to see spectacles on the screen.
Yeah, they love to see the tricks and the idea. And you know what? We still do. We love to see CGI. We love to see special effects. It's always
this type of
like
cinema is what Tom Gunning calls the cinema of attractions, and it predates the cinema of narrative integration that comes later with the feature film. The most infamous example of these exciting, thrilling one-shot films is Lumiere Brothers' A Train Arriving at a Train Station. According to doubtful legend, the cinema attendants were so shocked that they actually ducked and in some cases ran out of the theater. We usually call these films black and white, but it's important to remember that Most of these films weren't presented in black and white at all.
This is the beginning and end of the Great Train Robbery, which is the first real narrative picture. Now, again, the whole thing goes in a circle. If you ever see Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, he does the same thing. It's the same shot at the beginning and the end, and that's not an accident. All these movie people, they pay homage to each other left and right.
As early as
That really freaked people out when they saw that in the theater.
1896, films were painted, hand-painted, with color and toner to enhance mood and atmosphere. Likewise, though these films were silent films, they almost always involved sound. Cinemas would incorporate orchestras or live bands to score the happenings on the screen. In some cases, they'd have lecturers who would literally explain the events that were happening in the narrative.
Suddenly, the galley strikes upon an enormous rock, which emerges from the midst of the...
We got the idea. But
Edison's man, Edwin S. Porter, is perhaps the best example of director as simply camera operator. However, the French director Méliès not only operated the camera, he had control over the artistic direction and narratives of the films that he produced. It took no time for production companies to develop, particularly in America, where the emphasis was on the speed of the production and not necessarily the quality.
some things never
Now,
change.
they operated this way under the logic that it doesn't matter how good or bad the film is, it was still going to sell for the same price per foot. American production companies started to hire several directors, each with their own cast and crew, who were all responsible for one task: produce at least a reel of film each week. This practice of mass production eventually led to a new role, the role of a movie producer, whose job it was to supervise all of these different productions and make sure the quotas were met. Not satisfied by high demand alone, studios began to expand operations into the highly lucrative field of distribution. In 1906, Nickelodeons appeared. These small theaters got their name from their practice of charging 5 cents or a nickel for admittance. Nickelodeons were wildly popular. In the span of just a few years, their numbers more than tripled. By 1909, the cinema attendance was estimated at 45 million people.
That's more than half the population of the United States. Everybody's going to see movies, even if they're only 5-minute shorts. It becomes quite the popular thing. And at 5 cents a shot, it's affordable. So they became very popular very quickly. And once people got used to it, then they got a little bored. So they wanted to see more. And we will see some more.
Per week. Audiences were beginning to complain about unclear narratives. In the period between 1907 and 1917, huge measures were taken in order to produce a clearer, more cohesive narrative. For the first time, editing promoted narrative intensity and not...
From the Great Train Robbery, Edward S. Porter, who first worked for Edison and then he worked for one of Edison's competitors. You have close-ups far away. Here we have a live shot. You have, and they'll talk about some other little things that Porter came up with.
Not just shock value. American director D.W. Griffith led the Americans in this push towards longer narratives. When he first began directing in 1908, his films incorporated on average around 17 shots. By 1913, that number jumped to 88. D.W. Griffith met a lot of opposition with the American studio system because the Americans favored shorter films under the logic that the shorter the film was, the more that they could play in the Nickelodeon, the more turnover they'd have, and the more nickels the studios would produce.
Yep.
In 1913, Italian cinema changed the world with the feature film Quo Vadis. It contained 5,000 extras, a choreographed chariot race, and actual lions. Faced with this competition, American studios commissioned D.W. Griffith for his dream project, the 1915 feature.
Yes, we'll get to that. Birth of a Nation, the first 3-reel 2-hour movie. The problem with Birth of a Nation is,
The Klan.
The Klan. The Klan is the heroes, who protects the people of color and keeps them in their place where they're safe. And the bad guys are the Union soldiers. So, but on the other hand, that does bring race relations to the forefront of American discourse. So yeah, it's really bad today. And a lot of people thought it was bad even then. But it started a conversation. Oop, we have somebody in chat. Yep. And that's very true. The popularity of the Klan rose the 20s and the 30s, largely because they were heroes in this film. Very good, Quentin. Thank you.
Featured The Birth of a Nation.
Okay. We'll go to our next thing. Okay. A few more little bits and pieces here.
Every single corporate event that we do is started with a DocuSign signature. We add signers, adjust the field.
All of Edison's inventions, we get to at 4.
Himself, but relied on hiring creative experts. Still, he was the self-proclaimed Napoleon of technology. So in the 1890s, Edison and Scottish inventor William Dixon rolled out the kinetograph, the first motion picture camera, which Dixon invented
And of course, you saw the other folks gave at the same time credit to the Lumieres. A lot of people working on this. Oop,
way. I can update you on stock prices or the movements of
oops, sorry.
And Scottish inventor William Dixon rolled out the kinetograph, the first motion picture camera, which Dixon invented at Menlo Park. Film movie cameras work by
I
taking...
wanted to show you this. Edward Muybridge took a series of pictures to prove that a horse's at some point all 4 of a horse's hooves were off the ground, and the way to do it was to make a movie.
Lots and lots of photographs called frames. When they're played back quickly, they give the illusion of motion because the human brain can only process so many images per second before it just gives up. Edison also created the prototype for the kinetoscope, the first device for individual movie viewing in 1891. He debuted his device in Brooklyn in 1893, and in 1895, Edison created the kinetophone, adding sound to his movies via a cylinder phonograph. Edison's early movies were not exactly Oscar-worthy, although perhaps YouTube worthy. They were only 1 minute long, and they often lacked elements we associate.
But you go put them in the Nickelodeon and it's a big deal. So I just wanted you to see the Muybridge horse sequence. Muybridge ran his movies at 30 frames a second. That's the way it still is today. But then when they really start thinking, the people saw little scenes at the Nickelodeons, then the big thing happens when Porter and others start really making that visual narrative.
The earliest days of film are full of self-taught artists doing lots of experimentation and stumbling across many a happy accident, and some sad accidents, probably. Nobody really knew what they were doing.
Craig Benzine, who does these movie history videos, is really irritating, but he has a lot of good material.
Doing. They were making it up as they went, and audiences went along for the ride. At first, people were impressed by the sheer technical marvel of moving pictures. But thanks to George Méliès's passion for dazzling illusions and tricky editing, film began to emerge as a new medium for stories. As filmmakers started to experiment with narrative film, they began to establish a language through different editing techniques and camera movements. And with any language comes rules, things like grammar, syntax, and punctuation, which can help artists and storytellers communicate their ideas in clear and interesting ways. But before rules can be followed or broken or mastered, they have to be discovered by someone. And for film, that someone is Edwin S. Porter. And for eagle punching, that's me. George Méliès was a stage magician whose whole approach to entertainment was to wow an audience with illusion, extravagance, and surprise. So it makes sense that his films, as impressive and influential as they were, operated as performative spectacles. This type of filmmaking is more interested in presentation than representation. We're supposed to
You show the tricks, but there's not really much of a story.
sit back in slack-jawed amazement at the mysterious feats occurring before us instead of empathizing with characters or finding ourselves on screen. The film scholar Tim Gunning calls this the cinema of attractions and offers it as a way to think about the entire first decade of film, where the novelty itself of film is enough to keep people buying tickets. You've probably experienced this concept at some point. A new technology comes out and at first we're all marveling at what it can do, like posting shaky
Cat videos. When YouTube first came out, everybody was sharing cat videos, but and I have a cat down there somewhere, the novelty wears off.
vertical videos of your cat online for everybody to see, or wandering around outside throwing virtual Pokeballs at virtual Pokemon, speaking of. Got him! But eventually the newness wears off and people want something more. I haven't played Angry Birds in many months. That's what was happening in 1903 as mainstream films started to focus more on narratives designed to engage the viewer rather than simply astonish them. And that's exactly when Edwin S. Porter entered the filmmaking scene. Born in 1870, Porter worked as a sign painter, telegraph operator, and minor inventor before becoming a touring projectionist. He traveled from South America to Canada exhibiting films for a device called a projector scope, one of Edison's competitors. Part of Porter's job was to assemble the various actualités in short films into longer feature programs. He picked the order, created transitions between the films, and arranged for any musical or spoken accompaniment. Now, this feels like a good place to make a point about silent films, because there was no such thing. What? I mean, even in the golden age of silent film, movies were almost never shown in actual silence. We call them silent films because the technology to record synchronous sound hadn't really been invented yet. But that doesn't mean that folks gathered in theaters, church basements, or barns and watched films in pin drop silence. Larger venues employed full orchestras, bands, or organists to accompany their films. Smaller spaces might have had a piano player or a phonograph. Or a guy who went, la la la. Probably not that, though. Some films were even released with scripts to be performed by live actors or voiceover narration to be read along with the images. So in 1899...
Yeah, so you have bands actually playing background music and people narrating. Well, when sound technology comes in, that changes.
And after his stint as a traveling exhibitor of not-so-silent films, Porter returned to New York. He eventually became the head of production at one of Edison's film studios, responsible for setting the stories, operating the cameras, directing the actors, and assembling the final films. Wore a lot of hats, that guy. This is where his time...
Yeah, Porter is actually the first real director. Before that, you point a camera and and you make some tricks. He's putting all these shots together to make a story.
As a touring projectionist came in handy. Not only did he have a good idea what kinds of stories and techniques played well in front of an audience, but he also spent a lot of time cutting together different pieces of film. In doing this rough kind of editing, he stumbled upon a bunch of techniques and effects he would put to use in his own multi-shot films. The most influential of these is called parallel action, or cross-cutting. It's an editing technique so powerful and which occurs in so many films and TV shows today that you probably don't even think about it. Basically, parallel action is the idea that a film can cut back and forth between two or more events that are happening simultaneously within the world of a film. Even though you're seeing these scenes in sequential order, your brain understands that they're actually happening at the same time. Like, imagine two parallel lines. Each one represents...
We'll get to some of this stuff. We'll show you. Okay, here's one of the first from
Fireman, made in 1902 and inspired by Méliès' A Trip to the Moon. The story follows, spoiler alert, an American fireman who rescues his wife from a burning building. The film begins with a napping fireman dreaming about his wife and child going to bed at home. I love napping. After the fire alarm is pulled and the firemen race to the burning house, we cut inside the building to see the wife and child carried out of the smoke-filled bedroom. Then the film cuts back outside the building and we watch the same firemen enter the same building and emerge once again with the wife and the...
Yeah, that's cross-cutting. And that's something Porter came up with just on his own, simultaneous action.
Child. Even though this innovation seems small, it contributed to film grammar in ways we still see to this day and affected what filmmakers thought was possible as they constructed their stories for the screen. Now, in 1903, Porter released his most successful film, The Great Train Robbery. Some scholars argue that The Great Train Robbery doesn't use parallel action
Thomas Edison, we'll get back to him.
in the same way that The Life of an American Fireman did. But I think a close reading of the film shows a sophisticated understanding of how a filmmaker can manipulate time by cutting between simultaneous scenes. In the film, a railroad engineer is knocked out and tied up by a group of bandits bent on hijacking a train. The heist plays out in a traditional linear fashion. Each scene is one uninterrupted shot after another, including a really long shot of the thieves lining up the passengers and stealing their stuff. Then a remarkable thing happens. And I'm going to remark on it. Once the heist is complete, the film cuts back to the railroad office as a young girl discovers the unconscious engineer, revives him, and sets him free. We then cut to a group of law enforcement officers at a dance where the engineer busts in and alerts them to the heist. And finally,
Yeah, you have all of these things happening at once. And Porter invents the outdoor shot, the indoor shot, close-ups. He's the first one using all of these different techniques to tell a story.
we cut to the criminals riding horses through the woods, being chased by the law enforcement officers. At this moment, the two time streams that were happening simultaneously, the railroad engineers and the criminals, suddenly merge. And the rest of the film plays out in another linear scene in which the officers gun down the criminals, dispensing the kind of frontier justice that would make Clint Eastwood proud. Contemporary films use cross-cutting all the time. Take the final sequence from The Godfather, for example. 70s, but contemporary. In it, director Francis Ford Coppola cuts back.
Oh, that baby is Sofia Coppola, who grew up to be a film director herself.
Back and forth between the baptism of Michael Corleone's godson and the slaughter of his enemies, church to bloodbath, and back again. Fun. This kind of parallel action not only shows us events that are happening simultaneously, but also connects them thematically and symbolically. Michael is consolidating his power as head of a major crime family through both violent and peaceful means, in ceremonies both sacred and profane, juxtaposing life and death. Not every use of parallel action is as profound as that, though. Comic book blockbusters like The Dark Knight or Captain America: The Winter Soldier cross-cut during action sequences to heighten tension, while thrillers like The Fugitive and The Silence.
Anyway, you see all of these techniques, and they all go back to the Great Train Robbery. So all of a sudden, you're getting these ideas of how to tell a story visually. Anyway, 1914, a big thing happens. Adolf Zukor from Hungary, a Jewish immigrant, says, hey, how come we always have to work with Edison? How come I have to pay Edison every time I show a movie or make a film? Zukor won, and then he moved to Hollywood. Here he is. There's Mary Pickford. He was from Hungary. He started Nickelodeon, made a lot of money, starts making his own movies, and he starts saying, how come I have to cut in Edison? He sues and he wins. And then he runs to Hollywood. Why Hollywood? Why do we, Edison's in New Jersey, the film capital's New York in the early 1900s. How come Zukor says, the hell with this, let's go to Hollywood, let's go to California? It's very similar to the same reason why free speech started in America. Any thoughts? California is about as far away as you can get in this country from New York. Even though you have the telegraph and the telephone, it still takes 6 days to get from New York to LA. So it's far away. Land is cheap. Edward Mulholland of Mulholland Drive was an engineer who opened up the aqueduct to the lakes up in the Sierras to bring water. So you have water, cheap land, lots of sunlight for the movies, and Independence, you're far away. Zukor says, let's go. And he starts Paramount Movies. So the movies start coming out. People started thinking, the audiences started liking the movie stars. They didn't care who makes the movies. They liked the people in it. Our first big movie stars, Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks. They got together to make an organization to represent the actors called the United Artists, 1921. We already talked about Birth of a Nation. It was still your first long movie. And
which of course inspired the Ku Klux Klan uniform we all know today.
It empowered them, and they had a big resurgence in the 20s and 30s. And so, unintended consequences. Then the next big thing happens. As Craig Benzine said earlier, and here he comes again, they weren't silent. You always had narration or music, but then you have sound.
We have this entire misunderstanding of what Darwin really meant when he said survival of the fittest.
Hey, hello, can you hear me? You can, good. That's because of something called synchronous sound. It means that the words I'm saying right now are being recorded, then matched with the video. So when you watch this, the sound of my voice is in sync with the image of me talking. We take that for granted today, but for the first few decades of film history, it wasn't possible. Theaters had to supply music, sound effects, and narration through phonographs or live performances. And when dialogue was absolutely necessary, filmmakers had actors mouth the words and then insert title cards, or intertitles, in the middle of the scene so the audience could read the dialogue for themselves. It took years of guesswork, tinkering, and experimentation to make cinema sound the way it does today. But when sound finally arrived, it changed the way movies were made and watched forever. What? You can hear me say, what? Now, thanks to that. Nothing shook the foundations of the film industry like the coming of sound. By the mid-1920s, the major studios were churning out movie after movie. The star system was in full swing, and cinema had become an integral part of popular culture. But in order to sync pre-recorded sound to moving pictures, artists and engineers had to overcome a few major hurdles. The first and most important was synchronization. How do you get the image and sound to match up? At the time, image and sound were recorded and played back using different...
You ever see at the beginning of the movie, they have that thing that goes snap, opens it? That's there so you can synchronize the sound of the thing snapping to the film action.
Devices, so there was no easy way to link them. Second, microphone technology was fairly primitive. Sound quality wasn't good.
Early German film Nosferatu, vampire films were always big.
Mics themselves were too big to conceal. Third, the process of recording and playing back sound typically required electricity. That meant production companies would need more equipment, larger crews, and access to power. And finally, there was the problem of amplification. Speaker technology at the time simply wasn't loud enough to fill a big theater. And the search for solutions to these problems went as far back as the 1880s. In 1889, Thomas Edison's assistant, W.K.L. Dixon, achieved a kind of rough synchronization between the phonograph and the kinetoscope. Eventually, he came up with a device called the kinetophone that used a system of...
All right, we can get through all the fits and starts. They tried, but phonograph didn't work together. Here's how they eventually...
When Eugene Augustine Lost, who worked for Dixon in Edison's lab, successfully recorded sound right next to the image track on film. In 1919, a trio of German inventors came up with something called the tri-ergon process. They used a photoelectric cell to translate sound waves into electric...
Yep, it's right on the film. All right.
Talking pictures or talkies were just a novelty that would fade away.
Yeah,
that began to change in 1926 when a subsidiary of AT&T introduced the Vitaphone system. Instead of sound on film, the Vitaphone was a sound on disc process that solved the duration problem by recording the sound on multiple discs. Genius. At first, the studios all passed on the Vitaphone. They said, no way! stage. Then along came Warner Brothers. At the time, they were just a small studio looking to elbow their way into the big leagues, and they decided to take a chance and be the first film studio to make and show sync sound films on a large scale. They leased the rights to the Vitaphone system, as well as the right to sublease it to other studios, and set about converting their theaters to handle sound films. Now, originally, they didn't intend to incorporate dialogue into the sound. Their idea was to simply use it for music and sound effects. Their first effort was the 1926 film Don Juan, a sumptuous costume drama starring John Barrymore. Before the film, they played an hour of sync sound short films, including musical performances and a brief spoken message from Will Hayes, president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, welcoming the world to the era of...
And the Hayes office also promulgated the first moral code for the movies. For example, if you had two people in the bed, on a bed sitting together, their feet always had to be on the floor. That's called the Hayes Code.
Sound. This is part of what he had to say.
My friends, no story ever written for the screen is as dramatic as the story of the screen itself.
People were blown away. They were like, what? That guy talking. Don Juan broke box office records in city after city. Film critics lavished praise on the Vitaphone system, and a Columbia University physicist said of the Hayes speech, "No closer approach to resurrection has ever been made by science." Now, this doesn't mean that the coming of sound worked out for everybody. Until now, screen actors had been trained to act through gestures. Suddenly, dialogue, not to mention your voice and your enunciation, had real consequences, and not every silent film star was able to make the transition. Buster Keaton, for instance, was known as the Great Stone Face for the stoic expression he wore, no matter how things were falling apart around his character. But then sound came along.
Yep. Yeah, his career went in the toilet, even though he made a few talkies and he had a minor comeback in the 50s and 60s. But yeah, he was even in a beach movie with Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon. But yeah, he wasn't the big star anymore. Who did become a big star was Al Jolson.
And the charm of Keaton's deadpan silence was lost.
Somebody has something to say. Yes.
When he started to speak, kind of like when I start to speak. Sound films also threatened the musicians that played live music at movie theaters. And of course, it was still going to cost a boatload.
Yep. Everything changed with sound. You didn't need the musicians or narrators anymore. Some movie stars didn't have strong voices. So you start to hire new people from Broadway who speak better. And then the first real big movie, The Jazz Singer.
The Jazz Singer. The plan was to make a film with music, not dialogue, but when star Al Jolson improvised a few lines, the studio agreed to leave them in, unlike most lines I improvised for this.
Now, Mama, stop now. Just sit there. Mama, listen, I'm going to sing this like I will if I go on the stage, with the show. I'm going to sing it jazzy. Now get this. Blue sky, smiling at me, nothing but little.
Yep. He's starting to sing jazz. Now, that was a big deal. Where does jazz come from? The word comes from New Orleans, coined by African-American musicians. The plot of The Jazz Singer was Jolson was a religious Jew whose family wanted him to be a cantor, a singer in the church. He wanted to be a jazz singer. And of course, in those days, he would appear in blackface. He would smear his face with shoe polish or something. And that's what they did. But still, it brings African-American music and experience to the whole country.
And that, this incidental spoken dialogue, really sent off.
Right. Meanwhile, again, some movie plots get recycled again and again. The plot of The Jazz Singer was also used in The Simpsons. It's the origin story of Krusty the Clown. So you have that, the talkies come in, and everything changes. You have the golden age of Hollywood.
I photographed in
And I know
New
his
York
Craig
and
Benzema.
Philadelphia and Paris.
But he does a good
DocuSign
job.
lets me take care of the business.
When I say Hollywood, you probably think of big budget movies, star-studded premieres, and studios with giant backlots pumping out film after film. Most of those associations really began sometime between the 1920s and the 1950s. Once audiences could hear actors speak, listen to pre-recorded musical scores, and enjoy sound effects, film cemented its place as the main medium for mass communication, art, and commerce.
There we go. It becomes, in the 20s and 30s, one of the major mass media, along with radio and print.
And as important as Hollywood was during the silent era, nobody could compete after the arrival of sound. New major film studios emerged, each with their own style and favorite celebrities. Before George Clooney and Jennifer Lawrence, there was Clark Gable and Janet Leigh. This cascade of films led to more technological innovations too, like color film and the widescreen formats we still use today. This was the golden age of Hollywood. Hollywood. Ba-ba-da-ba-da. Okay, I'll stop. After the stock market crash in October of 1929, most parts of the American economy took a real hit, but not Hollywood. And at the height of the Great Depression in 1933, roughly a quarter of the American workforce couldn't find a job, and millions of others were barely making ends meet. So you'd think that the last thing people would do with their hard-earned money was go to the movies. And yet, the Depression was one of the best things to happen to the American film business. That's depressing. In fact, more films were released by the major studios during the 1920s and 30s than any other decade, averaging about 800 a year compared to less than 500 per year today. It was cheaper to go to the movies than a play or a concert, and cinema became a means of escape. As we've talked about, films are an illusion of reality, and that illusion was super attractive to people whose day-to-day reality was often pretty bleak. Genre films became more popular, things like gangster films, musicals, westerns, and screwball comedies. Anything to take people's mind off their own struggles and celebrate good old American values of optimism, resilience.
Yep. The movie studio guys actively tried to promote those images. And the interesting thing is they were all Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. They invented so much of the American myth because that's what they wanted America to be. And they promoted it and that image because that's the America they believed in.
Ambition and courage. At the height of Hollywood's golden age, 5 film studios ruled the town. All 5 were vertically integrated, just like the major studios of the silent era. They each had their own distinct reputations and focused on different kinds of films.
When they say vertically integrated, I'll get to that in a second. But in the golden age of Hollywood, you had the studio chief, the owner, would say, let's make the Wizard of Oz. They'll put the package together, they own the theater, and there it is in the theater. That later changed.
Films. First up, we have Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, or MGM, which was the biggest studio in the 1930s. Louis B. Mayer ran MGM with his business partner, Irving Thalberg. Mayer was the savvy businessman of the two. He approved the budgets and oversaw the distribution and marketing. Thalberg, on the other hand, was a former producer and the mind behind the stories and actual production. Together, they made slick, big-budget musicals, comedies, melodramas, and literary adaptations, sparing no expense on sets, costumes, extras, and the biggest movie stars. Think of The Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, and Mutiny on the Bounty. I'm talking opulence, people. Next is Paramount Pictures, which was known as the most European studio because they lured a lot of filmmakers.
Yep, that's Zukor's original studio, and he was still there.
Away from Germany and the UK. They also gave these filmmakers more leeway to put their own stamp on movies. Hits like Shanghai Express, The Sign of the Cross, and Morocco. Our third player, Warner Brothers, branded itself as the studio of the working class. They churned out low-budget melodramas, gritty gangster movies like The Public Enemy with James Cagney, and musicals set in the Depression like Footlight Parade with James Cagney. The fourth major studio was 20th Century Fox, which made its reputation thanks to its chief director and its most profitable star, not James Cagney. The director was John Ford, who won back-to-back Best Director Oscars for The Grapes of Wrath and How Green Was My Valley, while Shirley Temple sang and danced her way through a strip.
And who is she dancing with? Bill Bojangles Robinson. Again, we're starting to see African-American actors and entertainers coming into the more mainstream audience.
String of wholesome hits. And lastly, RKO was the home of the extremely popular Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers musicals. Can I do a dance number, Nick?
Nope.
RKO also took a lot of chances, producing everything from Howard Hawks' screwball comedy Bringing Up Baby to the 1933 version of King Kong, and one of the most influential films of all time, Citizen Kane.
And what was Citizen Kane about? William Randolph Hearst. The young 24-year-old Orson Welles played Kane, but everybody knew it was Hearst, and Hearst was still alive at the time. See, our media all, you see, Wells knew Hearst was powerful. Hearst gave us the Spanish-American War. So it's natural to make a movie about it. Very good point. They distributed, Disney made the movies, RKO sold them. We'll talk about movie distribution in just a second.
Never heard of it. Now, all 5 of these studios dominated the production, distribution, and exhibition of films for a while, but a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1948, along with the coming of television, signaled a major turning point. In the case, known as United States versus
Okay. Well,
You're building an atomic bomb.
We prefer to call it a gadget.
What I'm about to tell you is highly classified.
but the point is, we'll get back to 1948 and what happened. But first, we have the distribution motto. Come on. Do it. Producers and writers pitch an idea, and that's why it is today. Hey, let's make a movie. The producer puts the package together, gets the set, hires the actors, hires directors and film crew, and puts it together, and rents the studio on which it makes, in which where it's made. And then the theaters come and they say, oh, we'd like to show that movie, and they rent it from the movie producers. Now, before 1948, all of these people were the same folks. It was Goldwyn says, let's make a movie. Let's make Gone with the Wind. It's his idea. He doesn't have to pitch it because he's the producer. He hires the director. He doesn't have to rent a studio. He owns one. And then Goldwyn owns the theater. So when they talk about vertical integration, that's what they mean. You have an idea, you make a movie. That's a lot of power that the studio heads really had. That changes. Supreme Court 1948 says, no, you can't control everything. You could not own a theater, so you start having independent theater owners renting movies. They go to film festivals, see the movies and go, I think we'll rent that. People will come and see it. That's when you get a distribution deal. Again, you didn't have to have that before 1948. So, what difference do you think that made? Well, if you had a person who controlled everything, you see that one person's vision, but they don't have to worry about money because they have the money. They could do what they want. Arguably, quality was better. Now, the theater owners, they want people to come to the theater. So they're more interested on packing folks in than they are appealing to any artistic sensibility. So things changed. Then, after World War II, television comes in. Everyone stays home to get their entertainment. Attendance in movies goes down. So what the movies do, like Mr. Benzine says, and we're almost done with him, they start giving you things you can't see on TV, and those are those big blockbusters.
Today, you want things to be on autopilot
Huge increase in orders.
and to be prepared for changes.
I'll be right in.
With IBM, you can do both. Bringing data together across clouds helps you modernize operations so you can keep those wheels moving.
Nice work, guys.
Deviled eggs are one of those recipes.
What's playing at the multiplex today? Another big budget sequel, the same old romantic comedy, yet another superhero movie? Probably that last one.
Yeah.
A lot of time, Hollywood is driven by trends. The success of one film or genre inspires others to jump on the bandwagon, and that's how we end up with nothing but reboots and dystopian fantasies.
Yep.
The same thing happened after World War II. Audiences around the globe were getting tired of the films coming out of Hollywood, calling them artificial, self-important, and inauthentic. From the Italians in the 1940s to the French in the 1960s, and even independent directors at work today, filmmakers have found ways to challenge the classical Hollywood model by creating their own vibrant and original films. So let's talk about Italian neo-realism.
Well, we don't necessarily get into all the movements. He gets a little esoteric here, but the point is you get new ideas. You know, many of the films on the back lot, people couldn't get together, couldn't have sex. So they're ready for something new.
Piece, Rome, Open City. Set and shot in the Italian capital just after the end of the war, the film tells the tragic story of a handful of characters living under Nazi occupation. Rossellini mixed non-actors with movie stars and filmed in and around buildings that had actually been bombed. The film has an extremely rough look, a plot that meanders from character to character, unexpected and shocking deaths, and an ambiguous ending. Nothing about this film screams classical Hollywood, and that's what helped turn it into a hit.
Yep, they're doing something different. And the French start doing the same thing. Oh, here's a great quote.
Because your subjects are bad. Your casts act badly because your dialogue is worthless. In a word, you don't know how to create cinema because you no longer know what it is.
And that's what the French directors are saying. You don't know what you're doing. We're going to give you something new. That was Alfred Hitchcock. We start seeing
film Les Cousins, and Francois Truffaut directed The 400 Blows. Truffaut's film was selected to screen at the hugely prestigious Cannes Film Festival, where Truffaut won Best Director. Suddenly, these scrappy young critics were being recognized as major international film stars, and it put French New Wave on the map. This style involved making films swiftly with minimal crews and lightweight equipment, like Wheezy Waiter. Actually, no crew for Wheezy Waiter. Advances in camera technology, along with faster film stocks, allowed them to shoot with available or natural lighting instead of hauling around lights. The film's plots often felt spontaneous and absurd, featuring tangents, casual and irreverent humor, a frank approach to sexuality, and sometimes obscure cinematic references and in-jokes. French the llama, that's neat. They used lots of tricks to remind audiences they were watching a movie, to really play with that illusion of reality, things like jump cuts or characters talking directly to the camera.
So yeah, they're playing around. Let's see something different.
World, from similar new waves in Brazil, England, and Spain to post-war Japanese cinema, and the rise of the post-colonial third cinema movements in Africa and South America.
All of a sudden, we don't need that Hollywood stuff anymore. We want our voices.
Couple episodes, we'll spend some time examining world cinema in more detail. Meanwhile, in the United States, that 1948 antitrust lawsuit we mentioned last time, United States versus Paramount Pictures, Inc., forced the major studios to give up their theater chains. Suddenly, the marketplace was theoretically open to all kinds of films, not just whatever the biggest studios wanted to show in theaters. Hollywood studios were stubborn, though, and didn't want to give up their money and control to the tidal wave of brash young filmmakers that were sweeping the rest of the world. But as the 1950s rolled into the 1960s, the studios found themselves in real trouble. Boy, howdy. After losing their theater chains, they began facing stiff competition from a little thing called television. As 1970 approached, the baby boom generation was coming of age, the war in Vietnam was in full swing, American politics was at its most violent since the Civil War, and studio film seemed increasingly out of touch. Ticket sales were falling, and studio executives were in an outright panic. Studio executives like money, you guys. So, in the late 1960s, a set of films seized the opportunity to challenge the studio system from both inside and outside. Two New York-based magazine writers, David Newman and Robert Benton, wrote a script called Bonnie and Clyde about a pair of charismatic Depression-era bank robbers on a crime spree. Their goal was to create an American film in the style of the French New Wave, and in fact, they almost got Truffaut to direct it. Arthur Penn directed the film instead, starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, and after winning over some influential critics, it became a sensation. With its unapologetic sexuality,
it was one of the bloodiest movies I have ever seen. I mean, they didn't spare anything. When someone got shot up, they got shot up. And it was shocking, but people go, wow, I can't believe we did that. You start seeing all sorts of different movies, shocking audiences, but you can't see that on TV.
casual humor, and surprisingly brutal violence, Bonnie and Clyde was a watershed moment in the history of American film. It was made by Warner Brothers, but the film's success led to a cascade of independent films made outside the major studio system. In 1969, Dennis Hopper partnered with Peter Fonda to make a motorcycle road movie set to a contemporary rock and roll soundtrack. Produced on a shoestring budget, Easy Rider became a massive financial and cultural success. In many ways, these two films, along with movies like The Graduate in 1967 and Midnight Cowboy in 1969, ushered in an era of surprisingly personal, idiosyncratic American filmmaking and proved that unique original films could also make money. And so could Dustin Hoffman. At the same time, the older generation of studio executives began to retire. They probably were okay, though. They probably retired on a beach somewhere, very nice. In their place came a new crop of Hollywood decision makers who were shaped by the same societal forces as the younger filmmakers, like the rise of the counterculture and Watergate-era politics. Suddenly, filmmakers with original visions who wanted to tell risky stories could get financed by major Hollywood studios. And that's the way it stayed until this day. Nope. Directors like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, Brian De Palma, and Robert Altman were supported by big studios and made films that reached an audience hungry for something new and fresh on screen. This window of creative control and experimentation came to be called New Hollywood Cinema and lasted from about 1967 to
Right. They're trying different stuff in the 70s. Yep. And that's, by the way, MPPA rating system. So you know what you get. Purely voluntary. No law says you got to do
1980,
that.
and it came to an end for a few major reasons. Many of these new Hollywood filmmakers began working with larger and larger budgets, which put more pressure on them to succeed at the box office.
Yep. They had to make money. So what makes money? I'll show you.
Attracting new customers has been tricky.
So we claimed our free business profile on Google.
Yeah, now we can accept bookings, list our products, even post updates.
Our free business profile helps us stand out and connect with customers on Google.
What makes money? The big blockbuster. And because you need to get people to come to the theater, they give you all the battle music, all of that stuff.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Mm-hmm. So you start to get Star Wars, Indiana Jones. Still, little movies are out there as they decline.
Hello, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Film. Gone are the days when the only
Right. The thing that happened, home
film industry
video.
and the ways we find and consume motion pictures.
In the 80s, you get home video.
Film in the mid-1930s. The first standard 8mm film
Little films. I mean, you make them yourself of your
drawback. When
family
8mm
pictures.
film was projected on a big screen, the image quality couldn't hold a candle to 35mm. Most home movie makers weren't projecting their films onto giant screens, though. Instead, they just hang up a sheet or use a plain wall. And for that, 8mm film did the trick. In the 1950s and 60s, as the American middle class expanded after World War II, 8mm film cameras became more common. Chances are there's some grainy, unsteady footage of your family's old vacations, birthdays, weddings, or other special occasions tucked away in an attic somewhere. Whose attic? My attic? Now, what really brought home movies into the mainstream was the advent of home video technology. And Betamax, or Beta for short, was one of the world's first. Invented in Japan and introduced to the United States in 1975, Beta could record audio and video signals to a magnetic tape, much like the ones.
So you don't have to go to the theater anymore. You could rent a movie. You can go to the video store.
Every other horizontal line in a given image, leaving the others blank. Each of these sets is called.
And yeah, you can see movies have a wider field. They had to edit them down for a video, but it worked.
Places play home movies recorded with consumer video cameras, but they could also record TV programs and play videotapes of feature films. Suddenly, people could watch Hollywood movies at home whenever they wanted. Kind of. At first, it was way too expensive for the average consumer to buy a video cassette of a Hollywood film. The studios charged between $80 and $90 per tape. What? But rental chains could buy them in bulk and rent them out to the general public for a few dollars a night, plus late fees. Those rental chains, places like Blockbuster Video or Hollywood Video, along with independent mom and pop stores, flourished throughout the 1980s and 90s. Film studios started going through their film libraries and releasing old movies on home video form.
So first they lost money, but then they produced, released older movies and even their bad ones direct to video, and they started to make a little money. So they were okay with that. And then you have in demand, streaming. People aren't going to the movies anymore, and we're all seeing different movies. In the 30s and 40s, you're all seeing the same movies. All of a sudden, everyone's seeing different movies. Just like television, we're seeing different things. And next time we're doing the internet, everybody's seeing and reading different things. Comes to the modern area, on demand. YouTube, you can make a video, you can make a movie and post it yourself. Doesn't mean anyone's going to pay for it. Copyright issues. When I use some of these video clips, YouTube says can't do it. You have copyright issues. International copyright. The Chinese don't follow our copyright laws, so they take a lot of our videos and do them, and reproduce them in China. Attendance declines again. And who takes over the big studios? The conglomerates. Disney, Fox, Sony, Time Warner. They don't care, like in the past, what the audience, well, they do care what they don't care about quality necessarily. And that was, from the beginning. They care about the stockholder. Who's going to come to and pack in the theaters? People who read comic books. You get the same comic book movies because Disney owns Marvel, Sony owns DC. You have a comic book, you can make it a movie, a TV show, a game, cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. So that's why it's the way it is. Then TV, you get good TV like The Sopranos and Mad Men and The Crown. The TV becomes as good as the movies. And now you can premiere a film both at a movie theater and TV. Why? Because of COVID. We're staying home and the theaters closed down. To keep afloat, the theater companies put them on TV. Why we're in trouble? Consumer tastes are changing. It's not all the same things anymore. It's a system. Again, they're not doing anything experimental. They just want to make money. People are getting tired of it, and we're making our own films, and frankly, the big studios don't know what to do about that. Biggest problems. I have this problem. I started to get hearing aids. It's hard to hear the movies. It gets tiresome. The multiplex, people don't like to go to that. Too many toys, CGI, fat suits. We've seen it. It's becoming cliches. Trailers, yes, we see all this stuff in the trailers. Oh, the shaky camera cliche, like You Are There. Go on, movies that go on too long. Too much reverence talking about old movies. Oh, we need to get a bigger boat. How often have you heard that line? Not much originality. And the audience. Audiences have changed. We seeing what we want to see. The reason why the Transformers is made is because more people will see it. But it's getting old. So there's all sorts of different movies out there doing different things. And so brings us to the modern era, where audiences are maxed out. We've all seen everything we're going to see. Of course, after the recession, 12 years ago, fewer young people are going out, fewer young people have any money. There's always new innovations, 3D, IMAX, or always trying some gimmick to bring you in. Corporate ownership, I talked about. They're more interested in stockholders than making anything original. Quality. More money means, you know, you go to the lowest possible denominator. International copyright, different. Again, the Chinese bootleg our movies all the time, so they don't have to make their own. We see movies on these TVs and movies, again, movies go to TV. So it's changing, but they're always still with us. There's more stuff going on all the time. Movies are still with us. They shape our culture. What we see makes us think twice. How we dress, how we act, how we talk. They give us stories, and we, from the very beginning of this course, are attracted to stories. They have a lot of power, and it's something we share and see together, and that hasn't changed. Next time, it's the history of the internet, and then we done. I will see you next time. Any questions? All right. Oh, we have a question. Thank you. You're welcome. I'm enjoying doing. I love sharing this stuff. You can see I'm into it. I appreciate it, Jake. We will see you next time.